Oral questions by members.
Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Yesterday, an absolutely damning new report was released from Human Rights Watch, an international watchdog, an independent international watchdog. They certainly didn't mince words about the response of this Premier and his government to the extreme heat event that our province experienced. The report found that, and I quote, inadequate government support compounded risks for people with disabilities and older people during the recent extreme and foreseeable heat wave, and contributed to unnecessary suffering and possibly death, end quote. British Columbians were absolutely astounded when the Premier responded to questions about vulnerable people dying by saying, and I quote, fatalities are a part of life, and there's a level of personal responsibility. The Premier has consistently avoided answering for his government's failure to protect vulnerable British Columbians that died from an extreme heat event. But today they expect an answer. Can the Premier explain why he chose to say that this crisis was an issue of personal responsibility when his government had been warned about the risks multiple times, and when the report outlines the tragic outcomes that occurred were clearly a failure of this government?
Minister of Health.
Honourable Speaker, I think we recognize that the events of the heat dome weekend around June 28th, 29th, and 30th were very significant events for a lot of British Columbians. 570 cases in the preliminary findings of the coroner, people passing away related to heat. This was a singular event in the history of our province, one that had not occurred before in this way. As we discussed yesterday with the Leader of the Opposition, in 2009, there was a significant heat wave. 110 people passed away at that time. It was principally focused on the Fraser Valley. And this heat dome was 5 degrees on average higher than that, unprecedented in the history of our province. And that caused enormous hardship for people. The actions that the Premier has taken, the government has taken, have increased resiliency and reduced inequality. The actions the Premier has taken, the Minister of the Environment have taken leadership on the issue of climate change. But we have significantly more to do. And that's why all members of the House know, that we have to take actions based on this one in a 1,000-year event that has now happened this year. It's a once-in-1-year event now to increase the resiliency of British Columbians. We're taking those actions, and we need everyone at every level of government to draw the correct conclusion that we need to take action on climate change, and we need to be more resilient against the effects of climate change.
Leader of the Official Opposition, supplemental.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. What the Minister conveniently fails to mention is the fact that this government had warnings. There were reports that made it clear that this was a possibility, that hundreds of British Columbians would potentially lose their lives. 600, almost 600 British Columbians died. They were spouses, they were parents, they were beloved friends, and not a single answer from the Premier of British Columbia, not a single answer. No accountability from this government. Let's look at what the report said. Not my words, and the government members might find them uncomfortable. Here's what the report of an international watchdog said to this government. The provincial government was slow to respond. The Premier said officials were distracted by COVID-19 and did not think the heat would be serious. The public was not made aware of the emergency, and the Emergency Operations Centre wasn't initiated until after the heat dome began to subside. What an absolutely devastating report. Failure after failure by this government. What an absolutely tragic set of outcomes. In Fraser Health alone, 166 people died on a single day in British Columbia instead of the 10 to 12 that would normally be experienced. Many died at home. Many died alone. Many people called for help and no help came. And none of us will forget. I can't imagine the members on the opposite benches will forget that one family was so desperate for help they called a fire station and then they drove their beloved relative to the fire station. And despite heroic efforts, that British Columbian died in the driveway of a fire hall. It is clear that many British Columbians did not understand the risk. And make no mistake about it, the Premier's comments contributed to the tragic outcomes. So today, will the Premier take responsibility for his absolutely unacceptable comments? And will this government take responsibility for how they contributed to this tragic event in our province?
Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker. Thank you to the member for question. Honourable Speaker, the member suggests that emergency operations and health authorities weren't in place in advance of the heat dome weekend. They were in place. They were in place across the weekend. Led at a provincial health officer level by Dr. Bonnie Henry, led by the presidents and CEOs of the health authority, and indeed led by the Minister of Health, myself. This was, I have to say, expected to be a serious weekend, and responses were put in place across the board. What we saw, though, were events beyond which anything we have seen before, a 1 in 1,000-year event, which is now, as I say, a 1 in 1 year event. And our responsibility is to do what health authorities did that weekend, which is to take extraordinary efforts to protect people. That municipal governments did much of the same, opening up cooling centres around BC, actions of my colleague, the Solicitor General, to announce and to declare the risk to everybody in BC, the actions of the federal government. And yet what we saw was heat beyond which we'd ever seen, and its impact on those, not who we were connected with in the healthcare system, which there was better outcomes, although still some severe outcomes, but actions that affected people living in isolation in their homes. And so yes, absolutely, we have to make things better. Yes, we have to become more resilient. Yes, this legislature has to act to address climate change. We need to do all of these things. And nobody in British Columbia feels anything but grief for what happens. And our response to that grief has to be action, and that is what we're going to do.
House Leader of Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I remember when the Climate Change Risk Assessment Report was presented in this House in 2019, a report commissioned by this government, and it was a similar clapping then. Sadly, all they did was clap for the report, patted themselves on the back, Mr. Speaker, and then did nothing about the warnings in that report about the potential impact of heat waves. And in fact, the potential in that report was less than what actually played out. So the reality was government was not ready for the heat wave. Government did not have proper resources in place for the heat wave that everyone knew was coming. Ember is a 69-year-old woman from South Surrey with a physical disability. The temperature inside Ember's subsidized housing unit was 39 Celsius. 39 Celsius inside her house. She says in the Human Rights Watch report, and I quote, "I have never been so sick in my entire life. Money is scarce for anything so luxurious as a proper fan or, heaven forbid, an air conditioner." End quote. It's the vulnerable seniors like Ember who couldn't afford air conditioning or even a proper fan that the Premier told to take personal responsibility. The 570 families want to see some personal responsibility out of this Premier, some personal responsibility from the Premier to acknowledge and explain why he ignored his own commissioned report from 2019 and took no action in the days leading up to the heat wave to make sure those 570 vulnerable British Columbians were protected. Why did the Premier not take proper actions knowing this was coming?
Minister of Health.
Honourable Speaker, the emergency systems responded in BC and responded at a staff level with extraordinary courage around what occurred that weekend. Our ambulance paramedics, firefighters at the municipal level, staff of the government, staff in emergency rooms, staff who support vulnerable seniors at home who require home support, staff in long-term care, and all of our families and friends who helped one another. Everyone got on board to help one another, but we saw a heat dome and a heat wave that we have never seen before, and its impact on people, particularly people of lower income, particularly people with other vulnerabilities, particularly people with chronic conditions such as diabetes, particularly those people were profoundly affected by it, and we know that. And we have to, I think, in response to a 1 in 1,000-year thing that has now happened, is to build and create resiliency to provide supports. That means actions that decrease social isolation, which was in part, of course, caused by the other public health emergencies that we're facing. Problems that are dealt with continuing inequality, which has been reduced in the last number of years for people, and support for vulnerable seniors. All of these things, all of these investments have been made by this government, supported by this legislature and the previous legislature. But we need to do more. We need to be more resilient, and we will, I think, given the changing circumstances of climate change, be judged as a legislature, judged as a government, by how we respond on the issue of climate change and on the issue of building resilience of people and reducing inequality in our society.
Opposition House Leader on supplemental.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a little disappointing. The other side seems to keep clapping for an answer that says nothing more than resilience when 570 people died because of their negligent watch of ignoring a report. This isn't about the first responders' response. They were working flat out. The first responders were doing everything they could do with the resources provided to them, or should I say the lack of resources provided to them in advance by the Premier, who chose to ignore his own climate risk assessment report. The deadliest day of the heat wave was Tuesday, June 29th. 301 people died on that single day. 301. But on that very same day, this is how the Premier described how he felt. And I quote, "We were a bit jolly, a bit giddy," end quote. Those are the Premier's own words about how he felt on the day his government failed hundreds of vulnerable British Columbians.
Members, let's listen to the question, please.
They don't want to hear their boss's own words, I guess. Well, 300 people were dying.
Continue. Members.
He also said this: fatalities are a part of life, and British Columbians should take personal responsibility. Well, the Premier took no responsibility, no personal responsibility, to ensure that he listened to the report he commissioned in 2019 on climate change risk assessment. So instead, because no action was taken on that report about a heat dome event with warnings, we are now awaiting a coroner's report instead, so that action will be taken based on a coroner's report instead of a climate risk assessment report done ahead of time. When will this government take proper responsibility, stop trying to pass the buck, and actually acknowledge the failings of his own government when it came to this climate risk assessment report?
Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker, and thank you to the member for his question. I think that one can say definitively is on key areas of emergency response, action has been taken. With respect to the ambulance service, we went from funding that had been below the rate of inflation, more than doubled an annual increase, so we went from $420 to $560 million a year. And now we're doing more because we are acting to become more resilient. We're supporting in 24 communities in rural BC, going to a 24/7 staffing model. We're in another 26 rural and remote communities where the effects of climate change, I don't need to tell anybody in this House, are as profound as they are in urban areas. Increases there, a significant increase in buying new cars as we have over the next 3 years for the ambulance service. Because what we saw on that weekend was an increase in ambulance calls, the likes of which we've ever seen, the largest days of calls in the history of their province, well beyond anything we'd seen before. And we are taking action to become more resilient across the board. And we're taking action to reduce inequality. And we see this in long-term care, where people are vulnerable, and where when I became Minister of Health, 90% of care homes were below the staffing standard. And now the average across health authorities is above that standard. That's action taken to become more resilient, and we have to take more. So the government is acting on climate change. It's acting on inequality. It's acting on these issues. And still, these events happen. And we warn people, and we should be inspired to take more action. We should inspire to take more action. The idea, Honourable Speaker, the idea that this did not have something to do with climate change is wrong. It's just wrong. And we have to continue to work together as a community, and we're not going to compare actions, Honourable Speaker, on these questions. We're not going to compare actions on these questions. But what I would say is we have to continue to act, to learn the lessons, and to make things better for everybody in British Columbia.
Leader of the third party.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. A year ago, our province was in an election campaign, and on October 15th, 2020, the Premier stated that if elected, his government would implement the Old Growth Strategic Review Panel's report in its entirety. There is nothing to
Members.
talk about, including the recommendation, Honourable Speaker, including the
Let's
recommendation.
listen to the question, please. Just wait. Please continue.
Including the recommendation to defer logging of old growth while developing a new strategy. Where are we at a year later? As of May, this government's approvals of logging of old growth increased 43% over the previous year. First Nations that have requested deferrals on their territories are still waiting. And BC has once again seen the largest act of civil disobedience in Canadian history, with over 1,100 people arrested at Fairy Creek. And in the meantime, no new deferrals. And as I expect we will hear a whole bunch of numbers thrown around in the response, I will remind this House that an analysis by scientists of the 200,000 hectares of deferrals announced in 2020 revealed that only 4,000 of those hectares actually contained productive old growth needing protection as defined by the Old Growth Review Panel's recommendations. My question, Honourable Speaker, is to the Minister of Forests, Lands, Natural Resources, Operations and Rural Development. On June 2nd of this year, the Minister stated in an interview on CBC, quote, "I expect we'll be able to announce additional deferrals this summer." Will the Minister be announcing these additional deferrals now that summer is over?
Minister of Forests.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for the question, and I'm really happy to talk about this because I know how passionate everybody in the House is about old growth and about our forests in general. And just to remind the members that we have deferred harvesting of old growth in 11 areas across the province since the report was tabled last year, totaling nearly 200,000 hectares. We brought in a big tree regulation to protect over 1,500 groves of exceptionally large trees, those trees that people look to, those fantastic big trees that people want to put their arms around and can't. We've created an independent review, and we are committed to implementing all of those recommendations, as I have been saying, and all of those recommendations are being worked on. We've protected forest habitats for caribou, spotted owl, vulnerable species like the marble merilet and the northern goshawk. And we did work with the Pachidat, with the Didadat, and the Hawaiiat to defer over 2,000 hectares of old growth in the Fairy Creek watershed and the Central Walbran area. And Yes, we did strike a new independent technical advisory panel. I think it's made up of the very people that the member referred to, working together to identify the most at-risk old-growth ecosystems in the province and provide a basis for additional deferrals. The member may roll her eyes, but these are significant issues that we have dealt with and that we are moving forward on. We are implementing all 14 recommendations, we are moving forward, and we will be making more deferrals soon.
Leader of the third party. Leader of third party on supplemental.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I worry a great deal about when the reality that people are experiencing is not acknowledged or recognized by the people in here who they expect to represent them, who they expect to recognize what is actually happening. The talking points are well polished. They're great. And yet, the recommendation in that review panel's report indicated very clearly, 6 months after the review panel report was received by government, implement deferrals on old growth logging in this province. We are now 18 months since this government got that report, and on August 4th, First Nation leaders in British Columbia called on BC to take immediate action to protect old growth. And it's not about picking and choosing. It's about actually doing what you say you're doing, Honourable Speaker. The Minister of Health yesterday and today has been saying we need to take action on climate change. We need to take action to ensure that British Columbia becomes more resilient to climate change. It's astonishing. 43% more approvals of old growth logging under this government than the year before. 43% more according to government data. Keep applauding
Members,
that.
let's
Keep
listen to the
applauding
question.
that. Scientists have estimated there are 1,300 tons of carbon per hectare stored in the old-growth forest at Fairy Creek and in old-growth forests in British Columbia. The reason those forests can contain that carbon is because of their biodiversity. We don't need another technical panel. We don't need another report. The only thing that's getting deferrals on here is actually the action this government kept promising it would take. We need government to do what it promised to do. My question, Honourable Speaker, through you is to this Premier. The vast majority of British Columbians want to see this government live up to its promise to protect the last remaining old-growth forests in this province. When will this file be treated as a priority by this government?
Minister of Forests, Lands, Natural Resources Operations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again, thank the member for her questions. And it's interesting that she referenced Fairy Creek because it was actually the message that was coming from her colleague, from colleagues outside, was that was the last remaining ecosystem, the last remaining old growth, and we did protect that. We protected that. Our government's also committed to reconciliation and to environmental protection, and which we believe must go together, must work hand in hand. And the days of making unilateral decisions on behalf of Indigenous peoples, they're over. And we... And I believe I've been very clear, our government has been very clear, that in order to protect old-growth forests, we have to put Indigenous peoples at the front of the discussion, and that's what we're doing. We are having those discussions with Indigenous nations. We are looking at areas across the province, but we're also respecting the wants, wishes, and needs of Indigenous nations. And I just want to quote Hawaii Chief Councillor Robert Dennis, who said to people, "It is our responsibility to take care of our land for future generations. We are the decision makers. We follow the guidance of our elders and citizens to make the decisions we think are right. We are asking others to respect that process and follow our direction on our territory. Our citizens have a constitutionally protected right to manage and benefit from our lands, waters, and resources. And I think that we should all respect those words from Chief Councillor Robert Dennis. I think there's many other nations who have reached out and have said the same thing. And I think it's incredibly important that we respect the rights, needs, and wishes of Indigenous nations in this very important decision making.
Member for Kootenay East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, after the horrific crash involving the Humboldt Broncos, the provincial government moved to improve driving training, a move supported by the industry and, quite frankly, everybody on this side of the House. Drivers would have the opportunity to pass a test proving their skills before the new regulations came into effect. Again, all good. But then the pandemic hit, and ICBC has not offered the spaces for road tests. Darren Hudson applied June 1st for his test and won't get one until after the rule change comes into effect on October 18th. That decision could cost him up to $15,000. One company in my riding faces hard costs of about $55,000 and a total loss of $115,000 because ICBC has failed to deliver the road tests on time. And today, the province doubled down on penalizing these drivers who are ready to do the right thing. To the Premier, very simple question: will you do the right thing and grandfather those who, because of ICBC backlogs, can't do the road tests, instead of driving them into debt and out of business?
Minister of Public Safety.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. We are aware of the issue with ICBC and the road tests, and we are working to ensure that people who need to get the tests are able to get those tests.
Member for Fraser-Nicola.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For months, parents and the official opposition have been asking the Premier and the Education Minister for a clear back-to-school plan that keeps students, staff, and teachers safe. When it comes to vaccination of teachers and staff, the Premier's choosing to sidestep the issue and put it on to individual school boards, creating a potential patchwork of programs across the province. Parents across BC are frantic and worried about the explosion of COVID-19 exposures in their schools. And the Premier wants to make it worse, instead of providing the leadership that our parents are looking for. In my riding, we have 4 different school districts. Does the Premier really think there should be 4 different approaches in one riding?
Minister of Education.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and thank you very much to the member for the question. I want to say that I am extraordinarily grateful for the work that educators, school staff, our district and school leadership, trustees and parents have done over the course of this pandemic. We're now in our 3rd school year where everyone is grappling with the pandemic. And we have worked hard with the BC CDC, with all of our partners over the course of this pandemic to ensure that we have robust, strong safety plans in place. And that's what allowed us to keep our schools open and to keep school kids in class for all of last year. I understand. I talk to a lot of parents and teachers and people in the school community, certainly over the last several weeks, and I understand the concerns that folks have with respect to exposures in schools and with respect to the question about mandatory vaccinations. We do not have a public health order that would allow a provincial approach. We have a situation where, as the member well knows, having served as a school trustee, that school boards are the employers of school staff, and so I convened a meeting of all of our education partners yesterday to support the development of guidelines that will inform the decisions that boards will make when they are considering mandatory vaccination policies for their staff. And we expect that, as we have done since the beginning of this pandemic, the extraordinary collaboration and cooperation across all of our sector and all of our partners will continue as we deal with this next issue. Thanks very much.
Member for Peace River North.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. The lack of a back-to-school plan by the Premier has meant a scary return to the classroom for students, staff, and teachers. The number of cases in our schools are on the rise. We've seen the Education Minister already have to backtrack on notifications and masks. And British Columbia, sadly, is behind when it comes to using rapid tests for school exposures. Mr. Speaker, Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia have all announced rapid testing plans. But here in BC, parents are faced with long lines, delays, and panic when it comes to getting their kids tested. Even the Premier's former senior advisor, Myra Orrick, agrees, and she says, and I quote, "It took 2.5 hours to get my kids tested for COVID-19 this morning at BC's Children's Hospital. Given the lack of protection for kids, the least the province can do is to increase testing accessibility. More sites and more staff are seriously needed," end quote. And I can attest the wait is longer in some rural areas. We know that this government is sitting on hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of rapid tests that have come from the federal government. We've seen the continued stubbornness, resistance by this government to use rapid tests. So will the Premier protect school-aged children and use rapid tests in schools today?
Minister of Health.
Thank you, and thank you to the member for his question. I know he's expressing concern of many people in this community. In September, the gold standard test, the PCR test, there were more PCR tests in September than at any other time in the pandemic. Indeed, 4 times as many in the Northern Health Authority, as I've discussed with the minister, than had taken place during the height of the 3rd wave of COVID-19. We are increasing PCR testing. Never more than in the month of September have rapid tests been used more in BC. The technology as well is improving. The capacity to have at-home tests is improving, and those things will be explored by the people who are directing our testing policy, the people who are qualified to do it, the people who have been leading it from the beginning, our leaders at the BC CDC and the Provincial Health Office. And our government will continue to support them as they make every effort to ensure that children, adults, everybody are protected as much as absolutely possible from COVID-19.
The bell ends question period.